So today I wanted to make a video about relearning a language or reviving a language that you used to know that has since become dormant. And I'm going to use the example of my dormant knowledge of French and what I plan to do to revive my French. It's kind of funny and interesting talking about reviving languages, because a big part of my learning experience when I went back to Australia, which is one of the countries which I'm a citizen, last year, was I got very interested in this concept of language revival, revivalistics. I've been reading some really interesting books about language revival. So this is not about that, but I would love to talk about that another time. This is about how we can bring back a language that we used to know, or unpick the damage that has been done from, difficult or damaging experiences of language learning. So I'm going to use the example of French, which is a language that I used to know, that I now plan to reacquaint myself with, and more than that, develop a new relationship with and establish kind of a new way of interacting with French, of being in French. That sounds incredibly pretentious. I picked French because French for me was the second language that I learned, and it's the language in which I made all of my mistakes of language learning, like hours and hours and hours writing out vocab lists over and over and over and over and over, and also where I learned a lot about the damage that can be done with ways of treating language learners as though they're wrong or they're faulty, which I think is incredibly damaging. I'm contradicting what I said in another video, where I said that I'm thinking this year of taking A-levels in languages I never got round to taking, like German, Portuguese, and Italian. I'm actually thinking of retaking my French A-level 13 years, I can't do the maths, a long time since I sat in that exam hall as an 18-year-old, taking my French exam to get my A-levels before I went to university as a little 18-year-old. And I think I want to take it again, and I'm going to prepare to take it again. And I'm doing this for myself, to see if I can develop a healthy adult relationship with French and learning French and loving French and all the things I love about the French language, and to remove from it the connotations that I had, of it being really arduous and painful and a very difficult experience. So this is going to be a chapter for my relearning of a language, and to spark kind of a conversation. I'm going to upload videos from other people about their attempts to reacquaint themselves with a language that they once knew. And that's obviously a very personal experience. Often it's a language that people knew at home, that parents may have spoken, or grandparents. So many of my friends are Yiddish. It was the language of my grandmother, and it's very strange for me to try to get to know it as an adult. And also talk about the connotations that languages have for us and how we can overcome that. I had a very difficult experience actually with a different language, with Arabic, where some people, it might have kind of made something about my lack of proficiency in Arabic as a way to kind of be very kind of psychologically violent to me. And through that, I think a lot about how we treat others and judge others in terms of how we kind of perceive them as language speakers or not language speakers, and how we kind of police those boundaries. I'm unfortunately in many ways a product of the British education system. I like to think in lots of ways I'm not at all. My decades of living around the world thankfully got a lot of the Britishness of emotional repression and the class system. I mean, that's total anathema to me, but going to school in the 90s, and learning French, the way that kids in British state schools learned French was something I felt I then had to unpick. So I sat at the A level when I was 18, and then and I didn't get like a top mark, and that was hard for like a little nerd. Then went on to university and didn't use my French very much until I moved to Montreal when I was 22 for graduate school, whereupon I encountered this thing that was this language that was like real and human and fleshy and nothing like what I'd learned in textbooks, this Quebecois like Joual and like all of that tradition of like French Canadian literature that I was like so fascinated by. In Montreal as like this mini universe like within Quebec, with all of like the multiplicity of that, like all those influences that I found so like stimulating, like the Haitian influences, the Vietnamese influences, like the Jewish community there is much more Anglo, but I started to learn Yiddish at the same time when I was in Montreal. So when I started learning Arabic as well. So then like French suddenly became this kind of totally new thing, but it's almost too late for me because for me French is like that dead thing that I had to write out in like miserable grey English classrooms in like 1997, and it was really hard for me to kind of reformulate like what French meant for me. And I still do get, as much as I have changed so much in speaking foreign languages and my confidence to just like walk up to someone randomly and like try out my Korean, or like give Icelandic a go, or like write a message to a friend in my like Russian that I know will be bad, but I'll just try it because that's how you learn. I still hadn't learned that, and French was a language through which I learned how not to learn languages. And for me, it was an emotion which I've also thankfully moved away from as an adult, as I've grown and become more self-aware of shame. It was like this feeling of shame, like I couldn't speak it, and it was shame. And how French is a signifier, and as with everything, it's to do with the class system, but it's also to do with, it's a sign that you are kind of cosmopolitan, that you're European, and that I didn't sort of have an inroad into that was a sort of shame. I remember being around a lot of these private school kids at university, and their the ease with which they used French and Italian, and they knew Latin, felt like that was the way they're demarcating that they were sort of cosmopolitan and worldly, and I was a sort of embarrassing little, provincial thing that I couldn't speak French. And so French is something that I had to sort of relearn and also unpick my emotional responses to. I realize this is in no way an extreme as people who have emotional responses to languages where that language is bound up with trauma, or that language is bound up with family narratives of displacement, of intergenerational trauma. But in my own like very small way, French has been quite an emotionally complex language for me. And then when I was living in Tel Aviv, I lived near a lot of recently arrived French immigrants, Jewish families of French descent, and the sort of the multiplicity of the languages of Tel Aviv. The Russian beach is next to the French beach, then we'll go and speak Arabic in the evenings, and then we'll go over here and you'll hear this, the Polish and then the Brazilian Portuguese. It will be kind of everyone's from everywhere, and that's what that kind of that multiplicity of like Tel Aviv as universe, just as Montreal is a universe, really helped me kind of like begin to rework my my relationship with French. So what I want these series of videos to be about will be, I will talk about how I'm preparing for retaking my French A-level, and then I'll make a video once I've taken it this summer to talk about what that felt like for me. And it will also be about how to reacquaint yourself with a language. I think that's something that so many people struggle with, where you knew it, you no longer know it, but where do you start? Like you don't start with the beginner's app. Like I downloaded like a beginner's app again for French like a year ago, just to be like, oh, maybe I should just like lay the foundation from the start, and it wasn't working because that's not what I needed. But I also am not fluent. So how do you kind of get over that like intermediate plateau and find kind of new materials, at the same time as like refreshing, often kind of very dormant languages, as well as unpicking like the damaging ways that you've learned it before. So for me, like the mental association with French is just like writing out verb tables in like miserable classrooms with quasi-abusive teachers, like, and it just being such a kind of joyless experience. How as adults can we renegotiate our relationships with languages that we have had negative experiences with to make them ours again? Because like that's what language should be for. It should be about your own positive relationship with them, for them to open up worlds for you and points of connection for you. And we'll see how it goes with the A level. I may fail, who knows? I remember at 18 it was really hard for me that I didn't get like a top mark, like, because I had to get top marks and everything, and you know, my sense of self was so bound up with being like this straight A student, and in some ways it was probably very good for me because it was my first failure. I didn't actually fail, but I think that like that will happen in life was very good for me. So I'm not redoing the A level however many years later as kind of like vengeance on the British education system, but more just an attempt to see where I'm at now and to see where French will take me now.